Okay. So we've got two options. The last couple of weeks, I've been really happy with the amount of interaction and conversation. But obviously, it means that we don't get through all of the content. And for me, I'm okay with that because you guys have been equipped with learning guides and YouTube videos and a textbook, and so it's all there for you. And if we're talking about the questions you've got, then we're probably talking about something that you care about. So we could just start with, who's got problems? Well, who doesn't have problems? Let's not start with who's got problems. Sorry, Dave, it's not going to be therapy tonight. Or we could kind of just, make a start, and then you can pull me up where you've got questions. That might be the way to go. We'll do that. Okay. All right. Well, we always like to have a bit of a go at the context, just for the sake of those who do appreciate the visual learning. There is an activity actually to do on. I think it's the first page, page 12 of the learning guide. You'll notice I've got this map on the screen in your learning guide with a couple of little pin drops on it. To help, you have a go at plotting the path of the Israelites from their time in Exodus over here in Egypt. Because I know for some of us it's like, if I can see in my mind's map where they went from A to B and B to C, it helps me order some of the events as well. So in your tables, maybe you could have a bit of a chat and see whether or not you can't just pencil in a line there to jog your memory as to where the Israelites have come from and where they're headed to. So yeah, go for it. Tell us where the Israelites have come from and where they're going. As I can hear someone down on the under Canaan, but they take their time about it. Yes. Okay, this is the book where we learn that they spent an extra 40 years travelling somewhere which could have taken less than 2 weeks. So no, I don't think they lived up here in Goshen, so some of them probably lived on the other side of the Nile, but I think the Goshen, the city, is on this eastern side of the Nile. And so they make their way through the Red Sea, and then where do they go next? South. To Sinai. Okay. Now, again, for the sake of, transparency, or, I don't know, transparency, whatever. There are multiple proposed sites for Sinai. Where geographically they were exactly is a little bit besides the point. This is just for the sake of us sort of getting a picture in our mind of what happened when and where they were when that happened. So down at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula, there is a traditional understanding that is where Mount Sinai is. And at Mount Sinai, what happened there? Ten Commandments. Anything else? Golden calf happened there. Anything else? Orgy happened there. Anything else? How many people got killed? Who did the killing? Priests. Right? So if you guys step out of line, we're going to set Nick and Susie and Dave and Jess loose on you guys with swords. And there's biblical precedent for it. Okay. Then where'd they go? North again. Okay, so they started heading north. Where to? Well, eventually Haran, yeah?
Geber.
Yeah, Geber, so they're up on the other, I don't know what that there's called. There's a word for it. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but anyway. And then they make their way out into the desert of Paran and to a very important place. Starts with a K. Kadesh, Barnea. Alright, that there is basically on the southernmost point, while southwesternmost point of the promised land. And so being right on, it's kind of like being in Coolangatta if you were headed to New South Wales, as if you'd ever want to go to Tweed. I don't know, but jokes. D-bar's at Tweed, so sometimes we've got to go there. But if you can imagine that the border is sort of somewhere like this for the promised land. They get right to the border, and then we learn that they make a couple of mistakes there. 2 out of 2 million manage to keep together, but everyone else blows it. And then to get from here to the plains of Moab on the eastern side of the Jordan River, it's like 40 years. Okay, the Jordan River, I think maybe my next slide goes in. No, okay. So if the plains of Moab are the pin drop right up the top, the Jordan River, don't tell James Walton I'm standing on his head. This is like the Dead Sea, and then the Jordan River is that little blue line running up to Lake of Galilee.
So they had to go that one across.
No, they went in that way, because the problem is, so they've come up this side, and they cross through the Jordan River on that side.
Also, the Promised Land's all that green stuff.
Promised Land's over here. Yep. Well, to be fair, they do take up some land on the east side of.
Moses stands and across.
Yeah, so Moses, we know, or some of us know, he doesn't actually get to go there. We'll talk about why that is the case. But from the plains of Moab, well, not the plains, sorry, one of the hills in Moab, he's able to look into the promised land and see the land of milk and honey, but not actually go in. Except Moses does. Do you remember when Moses does actually turn up in the promised land?
He's talking to Jesus.
Yeah. He does get there. Just takes another, millennium. And then,
So Egypt is where the green patch is,
Yep.
all around there, and then Canaan's right next to it. That takes up the whole area.
well, Canaan it runs out the top of the map, but this is basically the Canaanite region. This is the Sinai wilderness, and that's Egypt over there, and then we have Arabia over on this side here, and Persia a little bit further out of the map. Okay, so that hopefully for some of us will just give us a bit more of a picture of where things took place. Because this book is, again, it can be broken up into geographical locations. Numbers like Exodus, you can sort of find divisions in the narrative that way, and that there's about a third of the book is written down here in Sinai, about a third of the book is written up here in Kadesh Barnea, and then about a third of the book is written from the plains of Moab. Okay. Now, when it comes to working out the purpose of a book, especially with the narratives, I've been trying to remind you guys as best we can to read the book, read it in its entirety, read it in its context, and then use your own sort of prayer and meditation to kind of try and decide for yourself, not independent of any help, but what the purpose of the book really is. And to help us do that, we try and get a bit of cultural and historical context. Obviously, we want to look at the Old Testament through the Jesus lens, which is revealed to us in the New Testament as well. But there are a few books that are what would you say? The purpose is clearly presented by a New Testament author as Numbers. And so when Paul writes to the Corinthians, he's a little bit stressed about some of their behaviour, and he says to them, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea." So what is he talking about? Okay, yeah, talking about the Red Sea and the cloud. Presence of God. So they're all under the presence of God, and they all move through the Red Sea. This is good, okay, because this is a New Testament author writing specifically to a New Testament audience about an ancient Israelite people, and we've got to somehow try and make a modern-day application. And you guys are developing the tools now to do that, or working on, or building on the tools that you've already got, I should probably say. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. We've talked about how the motif of like passing through water in these Pentateuch books, it's like Jesus bringing order out of chaos, and that's part of what happens in our baptism, is that he brings life out of death. And so they all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them. What might that be alluding to? Everyone seems very sheepish this evening.
They're all saying the same thing, aren't they?
What are they saying?
They're all saying the rock that Moses struck.
Oh, they're all wrong. No, of course. Exactly. Right. Correct. And they drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. What's that talking about?
Never made it.
Sorry, Trace?
I never made it.
Okay, so a whole generation never even made it to the promised land. Now, these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Somebody said, why is the book of Numbers in our Bible? You can say, oh, well, let me take you to 1 Corinthians 10. Verse 6, and it says, basically, Numbers occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. Apart from the orgy in Exodus, in Numbers, what happened there that alluded to sexual immorality or explicitly mentioned it? Yeah, Carolyn, so everyone can hear? Okay, so remember how they're sitting in the plains of Moab toward the end of the book, and then someone's trying to bring them undone, and they realise, that's right, men are hopeless. Send in some women. Okay, and so they all got bent out of shape over that. And in one day, 23,000 of them died. We should not test Christ, as some of them did, and were killed by snakes. Okay, see, here's again one of these opportunities for us to see that God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And while there are elements of the way that God has revealed himself to us now that mean that we operate in a relationship, the relationship is slightly different. God hasn't changed, and his holiness hasn't changed. And it seems to me that both the Old Testament and New Testament are pretty big on you can't mess with God. Like, you can't be flippant with God. And while we struggle with some of the stories, and there's some strange fire from time to time, and there's an earth that swallows up people from time to time. It's like, well, I don't quite understand this. I'm glad we've got the New Testament. The New Testament doesn't get you off the hook. Because it says it right here. 23,000 of them died. We should not test Christ. Alright, so this is the full revelation of God now, as some of them did. So it's basically saying, Paul's saying, what they did back then can be done right now. Okay? And they were killed by snakes. And do not grumble as some of them did, and were killed by the destroying angel. Okay, this is heavy. Of all the horrible sins that you could possibly commit, grumbling is not usually on the top of my list. Is it? And even sometimes I sympathise with grumblers. Actually, sometimes I'm leading the grumbling. Mostly, probably. Well, I don't know. I was somewhat convicted by that this week. Anyway, we'll talk more about that as we go along. These things happened to them, the Israelites, as examples, and were written down as warnings for us on whom the culmination of the ages has come. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. This is a good warning. For those of us that are complacent, thinking, yeah, we're sweet. We've got Jesus, man. Just be careful. This is a warning. Just, yeah, grace, yeah, okay. How do we do this without it not being... So the vibe that Dave gave in his grace, man, is the kind of grace that grace isn't. And it's just hard to say that because how does everyone all understand grace, man? But you can't. I think I'm probably pretty safe with you guys. Okay, let me pick up on some stuff that was a struggle for me going through youth, and then when I was a youth pastor, some of the things that were a struggle for the kids then. Premarital sex. Grace, man. Yeah, no. Jesus died once and for all. You can't get him back up on that cross by committing new sins. He forgave the sins of your past and the sins of your future. But we've learned that obedience and faith are so interwoven that if the lack of obedience is manifest in our life to the point that we're putting Christ to the test, it should be serve as a personal internal warning system. Where's your faith at? Okay, I'm not arguing that we have to perform to a certain level to be forgiven by God. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that is a really good indicator of where our faith is at. If we are so convicted that Christ died for our sins, we should expect then that there is a continuing sanctification process going. Sometimes it's two steps forward, one step back. I understand all that. But if we start making excuses for and then go down the line of grace, man, that's putting Christ to the test. In fact, last week in Leviticus we read, what was it? There's no sacrifice left if that's the way you're going to behave. Well, that's another one that we've probably got to struggle through a little bit more. Anyway, here's a heavy warning to get the evening kicked off with. Okay. Other things around context. First of all, the time period is still this loose confederation of tribes, and tribes is important in this to understand some of the really curly questions that we're going to have, hopefully that we're going to have from this book. So it's around about that 1500s, somewhere between 1500 and 1000 BC. Our author is still from the Pentateuch. We think it's Moses. Some people don't, but the traditional understanding, I should say, would be Moses. And then the target audience would have been initially who? Yeah, the Israelites, yeah, for sure, straight away. Yeah. And then, as Paul said, served as a warning for every generation thereafter. He didn't say every generation thereafter, but we can assume it was because he's saying for the generation of first century Corinthians, okay, that it served as a warning. Now, there is historical narrative that the law literature and all kinds of other weird literature find itself sort of housed in. So again, when we're reading, we've got to understand there are times where we're going to be reading a story, and so we don't necessarily get rules to tell us that this is right and this is wrong. We've got to make draw those conclusions ourselves. But then there are other times where there are laws, that this is right and this is wrong. And one of those is, if you suspect that your wife's been up to no good, haul her before the priest. She's got to sip some brackish water, and then if she has a stillborn, she's done the wrong thing, and if she doesn't, she's done the right thing. So that's a law. What?
How do you rationalize something like that with abortion?
Well, that's quite easy, actually. Moving right along. No, don't apologise. But I have no good answer. So maybe somebody else could help you out. Well, it does say the womb turns barren, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah. So I think I've done too much external reading around this particular passage because one of the questions would have been, how would have he been suspicious? And it would have been, well, she's pregnant. Yeah. And so maybe I'm just thinking of somebody else. So an assumption is that what would raise your suspicions? Your wife gets pregnant and you're thinking, hey, it's okay. We haven't been doing that for a little while. Or there may be other. Okay, so do we have problems with that? This is a peculiar law that seems to just jump up out of nowhere, doesn't it?
Well, what was the testing from the end?
Yeah, sexist, right? God's a misogynist, isn't he?
Do you think this maybe would stop them from drawing their own conclusions that there is a check in place so that they can't, just make the accusation they have to go to the priest now? They have to get someone else to do the check, and they have to more or less put it in God's hands.
So God could be a misogynist, or he could be looking out for women.
I read someone commentating on it, but they were saying this stops men from just taking it into their own hands and saying you're cheating and killing her or something like that. They actually have a, well, I think you're cheating, then we'll go to priests. It's actually easier on her than if a man suspected and was just taken off by emotion.
So did you guys hear that up the back? No? Okay, so whenever we get a verse like this, we remember we did 3 weeks on this right at the start, so I'm sure you will all remember. We want to read the immediate and broader context around the passage before we start getting upset. And then we need to also try and take into account the historical and cultural context to give us a bit of a picture of what might be taking place. And so we see a law that seems like it singles out women. It seems a little bit barbaric that, that women should be put to death for cheating on their husbands. And so we get hung up on that verse and we forget everything around it. And sometimes we rush into drawing conclusions absent of any historical or cultural context. And so what Tom is saying is that in that period we know that women were considered the property of men, and of their husbands or their father. And so if a husband or a father in some of those Mesopotamian cultures decided to kill their daughter or their wife, that was their prerogative. And that's look, everyone thinks that's horrible. No one goes, oh, that's great. But you've also got to remember, that doesn't mean that every man from the ancient Near East treated their wife or their daughter like their property, But this is the patriarchal society that they lived in, and so God steps in and says, hey, listen, we can't, Israelites, you're meant to be different to everybody else. And there is no way I'm having my people falsely accuse my daughters and then stone them for adultery. That's not happening. So here is a judicial system that I'm going to put in place to make sure that if a woman has been falsely accused of doing the wrong thing, it gets put back in my hands and I'll decide. Now, here's a test of faith. Do we believe that in those instances that God was just or was able to operate in the womb of a woman when she drank the water to make sure that if she didn't cheat, that the baby survived? Because that's a question too. Like, okay, every single time God made sure that she, it meant that men had to have a think. I can't just go around falsely accusing people. So we've got another cultural nuance to take into consideration. It was very much an honour-driven society. It doesn't. We impose that process on our culture, and it looks so crazy. But in their culture, it's like, oh, I can see how God might be actually trying to protect women. Now, it doesn't help us when it comes to the fact that if she's done the wrong thing and she gets judged for doing the wrong thing, that then she's put to death. But we've also got to understand that God has been pretty clear and pretty consistent. You are not to be like the other nations. And there is no messing around with the institution of marriage. We're not having it. You don't cheat. And
But what happened with the man? It's like only pointed the woman out. But what is with if the man cheated? Because back in Leviticus we read that they could have sex with the slaves.
Yep.
So they were probably married too.
Okay, so if men cheated, if a man and a woman was caught in adultery, both were put to death.
I know that.
If a man took a slave girl, he would have to do one of two things. He would have to marry her, or he would have to send her back to her dad and pay, I don't know, what do they call it now in the movies, it's alimony, child support, or whatever. You would have to pay for her to survive. Because remember, as property, they didn't have the capability of going out and getting the job of buying land. And so a father couldn't, well, it would happen from time to time, I'm sure, but it was uncommon that a father who didn't have a virgin daughter was able to offload his daughter, because that was like in a shame culture. He's like, I'm not going to be with her, she's not a virgin, she got raped or something. And we've also got to make sure that we have a clear distinction in our mind between what is genuine rape and what is a guy and a girl both consensually going, we're doing the wrong thing, but we're going to do it anyway. And in that case, I'd have to go and look at the laws again. I don't think that the word rape is used with the slave girl. I think it's when he takes a slave girl and sleeps with her. And I think that's to indicate that it's not rape, it's that it's a mutual agreement here. These two are horny and they're doing the wrong thing.
Yeah, but then he's still probably married.
Yes, okay, so that's a big problem that we've got. Polygamy seems to be generally accepted. So the idea that men can have multiple wives, there are even laws where it does, I think it says, if you take another wife, so this is a word from God, I think it says, and maybe someone could Google this for me real quickly, if you take another wife, so it's not saying that you should, but it's implicitly saying that you can, then there's certain behavioural standards that you've got to maintain. And I can't remember what that is exactly, but if you're the husband of more than one wife or something like that. Now again, there are some cultural explanations that we can use to soften the blow, but it only ever kind of softens the blow, and it doesn't ever make any one of us who believe in monogamy, or that the Bible teaches monogamy from Genesis, feel good about the fact that there's a whole period of time here where men were taking multiple wives. However, again, let's look at the context. If we immediately assume that because a man has taken a second wife that he has done so against her will, we're probably forgetting the fact that this woman may well have willingly jumped into the arms of a guy who is wealthy enough to take two wives. Absolutely, I'll do that. Because what are my other options? I can't be, I don't need no man. You do. In that culture, it's just the way it was set up. I don't think anyone likes it, and that's obviously why we've got the question. But yeah, we've got a genuine complaint, I guess, maybe to make with the Lord, Nath.
I just looked it up. I couldn't find anything where it directly said, yeah, you shouldn't. But the very first time it is mentioned that someone has more than one, it's
really
that murderous guy from
Lamech?
Genesis, and then every single story afterwards with more than one wife. There's always some crazy bad family shenanigans that happen after that. So even if it doesn't explicitly say this is bad,
Yes.
the story seems to say this is going to lead to disaster.
Yeah.
Whenever that does happen.
King Solomon had lots of wives.
And it explicitly says that was his undoing.
And that really undoing,
Yeah.
because they turned him into...
Yeah, but it still paints the wives as the baddie, though, because it's like, he was an idiot, he had two wives, and then he fell for all their false religion. One other thing to mention, I'll go after Ben, and then I think somebody else had something to say. Ben.
A few years ago, I was talking to a theologian about the polygamy thing, and one of his theories was because so many men died in wars all the time, and women were left and needed to keep multiplying the population for the next wars, that it kind of just happened like that too.
Okay, so
It's a theory.
you've brought in the broader context, which is something that we're not looking at. Where does this story just jumps out of nowhere, doesn't it? It's like, this rule. We're reading along, and then all of a sudden there's this random law about women and cheating, and except that it's not random at all, and it's placed in a portion of Scripture that's talking all about tribes. And so the way, again, the economic system, I guess, would be the best way to describe it, worked, was that inheritance had to stay within the family. And so you had to marry from within the family. And if anybody brought blood in from another family, that was a massive no-no. You couldn't do that. And so why this rule at that time, and why only for women? Well, you can't tell if a man is pregnant or got someone pregnant or not. There's no physical sign. In that culture, the only physical sign that you have is a woman getting pregnant. And so it seems like, hey, this is just on the women. Remember, if a man has done the wrong thing with a woman, he's also put to death. That's a previously established law. And just because it's not explicitly mentioned here doesn't mean that doesn't happen. And I sort of feel like I'm defending the law here. I guess I am defending the law, because in its context in the passage, that makes sense. They're trying to work out how they can keep these tribes in their tribes. And they're talking about like the importance of family names, and we know that there are some names here. Actually, Brian Spire said, what was the word that you texted me today? The writing was a bit verbose. Yeah. It's almost like they could have, Brian said it well, could have saved a lot of papyrus just by like summarising, the tribe of Levi had this many, the tribe of Reuben had this many. But it goes into certain names and certain groups of people, which later on in Scripture it's important we know that those names exist. And one of those names, Korah, is going to be very interesting. Okay? And so there is a reason why all the names are used, and there is a reason why that law appears at a point in time where the Scripture is talking all about particular tribes, and that we need to keep these tribes in there. We need to be able to draw up what compartments around these tribes. Yes, Megs. Well, so you're stretching me here. I don't know that it was important to God, though God does say that you're not meant to marry outside your family. It was certainly important to the people and the culture and their tribe, because remember the way the inheritance worked and finances worked is that the firstborn of every father or mother would receive a double portion of whatever that father owned. But to prevent land from becoming so dispersed and spread out that there were only little morsels of land left, it all had to stay within that one family name. And that would be why, so if a brother died, the Levirate, not to be confused with Levite, the Levirate rule around marriage, do you remember reading that in Leviticus? Okay, so this does kind of really justify polygamy in that, are there any sisters here? Here's how it would work. So is Sam here, my brother? All right, so Andy and Sam are brothers. And then I've married Beck. I've got my wife Beck. And then Sam has married Brioni. If Sam dies, the closest kin of Sam's is obliged to take on his wife. Now, okay, our culture, what? You can't make a woman marry another. No, that's not the way. That's not the heart behind it. The heart behind it is to protect the woman, not to oblige her to be with another man. It's so that she's got a livelihood. And so it would be my obligation to take her on, and provide for her, and love her, and care for her, and also to give her children. But they wouldn't be my children. They'd be my brother's children, so that his bloodline doesn't get watered down. Okay?
So they would get his inheritance and his property and all that stuff.
Exactly. It wouldn't then get sold off and dispersed into So it's with all that in mind, we've got to view these peculiar laws, and we've got to remember that God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and His heart is not to abuse women or take advantage of women. And so we've got to do the best we can to look at the context to make sure that the assumptions we're drawing aren't wrong, because they are what the text appears to be offensive. Yes, Tracy.
Well, where do slaves come from too?
Oh, yeah. Because you can beat a slave to within an inch of his life, but if he doesn't die, you don't get put to death.
So are they sort of half-caste or something? Or slaves come from...
Well, again, we've got to try and not impose our own idea of what slavery exactly was. Because there are laws within Leviticus that accommodate for the loving relationship between a master and his slave, so that the slave can be his son, become his son.
But are they part of the tribe?
No, the slaves by and large seem to have come from other people groups, but it does appear that a form of slavery would come about when, say, the Chilcots and the Swordens both live in Chugan and Currumbin, and the Swordens have fallen on real heavy times, and Tracy and Chook go, look, those Swordens are good people, we'll let them be our slaves. Now that sounds really strange, but that's actually, it would be like Chook going, listen, I've got work for you guys over at the factory. Can you guys sand? Yeah, we can all sand. All right, sweet. I'm going to give you all the jobs you can sand. And listen, I'll put you up. I don't have any money to give you, but I'll definitely feed you, and I'll make sure that you and your kids are looked after. And all of a sudden, Chook's like a philanthropist, not a slave owner. But it's some of that terminology that sort of gets lost in translation. All right, so we have, we've basically done activity 2. A breakdown of the way the book works out is we've got our chapters, written whilst in Sinai, chapters written while out in the wilderness of Paran, up at Kadesh Barnea, and then also the chapters out here at Moab, and these two little joining sections where they're travelling. And it does appear, I don't know if anyone watched David Pawson this week, but he did a good job of explaining how whenever they were stationary, God would tell them, here's what I want you to do. And whenever they were travelling, there were stories of them not doing what God had told them to do. And then so he'd give them some more rules. They'd be like, okay, now here's what I want you to do. And then they'd go for another stroll, and they would not do what he asked them to do. And again, I see this as a picture of God's grace. It's not like let's heap more laws on them. Here's me trying to train my kids. I'm trying to help my kids understand there are certain things you can't do. And at 3, when I would throw my food on the floor, Dad would giggle maybe, but I'm going to have to keep an eye on that. And at 5 and 6, he's like, okay, enough throwing food on the floor. You've got to keep that on the plate or in your mouth. You see how that works? Not to patronise the people, but to give us a bit of an analogy of how it is that God reveals, how to behave bit by bit. So in the first 10 chapters, we've got the census data, which, again, it seems to be ordered with a kind of military sort of sense, pardon the pun. And then they've got their ordered living plan, which depending on some translations, I must admit, I've always thought that this is exactly how it was described. I've seen some other diagrams that don't look just like that. But it looks like something, doesn't it? Yeah, fascinating. Okay, we get some more purity laws, and then the cloud moves. Why is that significant? The cloud is it's the theophany. That's right. It's the present. It's the physical manifestation of God's presence, and they would not move unless God's presence moved. And so God's cloud moved. They packed up the tabernacle, which is the little rectangle in the middle of the picture there, and they got out on the road up toward Kadesh Barnea. Okay, so on their way up, remember we talked about in 1 Corinthians the fact that complaining seemed to be one of the worst things you could do. It's like sexual immorality, testing God, and complaining. I don't know if I've heard much talk about it in church, but when there were complaints, God got really angry and he brought fire on Israel. And it was like the fringe. Do you remember reading the fringes of the camp? People got burnt up. And then, Moses is quick to pray, God, chill. And then they complain about not having enough meat. Again, this one really confuses me because they've just been given, how many laws on how to butcher meat. That was interesting. So the quail comes, and then we have not just the people of Israel complaining, but Miriam and Aaron. What are they complaining about? Moses. Jealousy. I thought this was a really good one. Because, they were basically 2IC, to the man. And it's, I don't know, it just reveals stuff about people, hey? How close to the top do you need to be before, you're not looking at somebody else and going, oh, I wish I had what they've got. I went up and spoke at a thing up in Brisbane with some uni students, and I was with Dave Quack, and we just asked them how much, as far as percentages go, if you could be in the top 50% of the richest people in the world, would that be good enough? And most people were happy at the top 25% of the richest people in the world. And we worked out that if you earned $9,000 annually, you're in the top 25% of the wealthiest people in the whole world. And that $2,000 got you in the top 50%. Enough is never enough. Okay, keep moving along. So we get up to Paran, and this is one of the coolest stories I reckon in the whole Old Testament. We've been looking at this Pentateuch with a couple of questions in mind. What are the Israelites reading this for? What are they thinking, and what are they looking for? And the whole narrative so far has been God's made a promise to redeem the world, and the way that is going to play out is with a people who will be blessed with lots of descendants, land, and that they will be a blessing to the whole world. And so we see God partially fulfill this in a number of different ways, and his presence is now with the people in the tabernacle. It's like, wow, God is coming good on these promises. This whole 5-part series is all starting to come together. And then they're about to now finally, as a huge group of people, inherit the land that God had promised them all these years ago. And they make their way up to Kadesh Barnea, right by the sort of southwestern corner of the promised land. Moses, under God's instruction, sends 12 guys up into the promised land. And we know the story, right? How many come back? All 12. How many think it's a good idea to go in and take the promised land? 2. 2 out of 2 million think this is a good idea and we should do it. Everybody else goes, nah, not a good idea. And this here, again, this is not a social science class, but I can't not make mention of this. The argument of majority is the worst argument you can ever make to justify a position. All you got to do is walk back through history and look at all the horrible things nations have done to their own and look at where the majority sat. If you're trying to justify truth because the majority thinks so, you have got a whole human history of that being a really, really shaky position to take. In fact, it's almost to the point that if the majority thinks so, you need to have a good, long, hard think about whether or not what the majority say is really true. Like, if you're in the majority. It just seems that especially when it comes to, like, big decisions, there's one or two that are like, I don't know about this. And the majority go, we should stop being such a handbrake, you know? And it's probably wisdom to go, we really need to have a good, long, hard think about what they're saying. And now in this case, it was the majority that were the handbrake, and it was the 2 that were like, God's made a promise, he's kept good on every promise so far, let's get in there and let's take this land. And again, going to Pawson, one of the pictures that mental pictures that he draws is that for the 10 Israelites who came back and said, the people of Canaan are huge, they're big people, maybe they're giants, you know. That was enough for them to say, we'll get destroyed if we go in there. But Pawson was saying, Caleb and Joshua, the 2 that thought it was a good idea to go in, they knew that they were going to be going in carried by God. And he said, like, do you ever remember as a child being carried on your shoulders by your father? And how, like, immediately you're taller than the tallest person in the room. Just by sitting on the shoulders of your dad. He was kind of like, they knew they were getting carried on the shoulders of God. I thought that was a really cool image. And it was something that has helped me when there have been times where you've got to actually stand up against the majority. And you're going to go, man, I feel like I'm just going to get my head, screamed off here. But I'm actually going in on the shoulders of my father. I feel convicted that this is the right thing to do, and I'm going to do it. And that has helped me no end with a couple of, I don't know. There was a time here where I had to, at Living Temple, thank the congregation for all agreeing to put me on staff. And then 2 weeks later, I just knew that was the wrong thing to do. Every single person that I spoke to said it was the right thing to do. You should go on staff. Every single one. There was one person who said they had to go. You shouldn't be there. And it was one of the most humiliating things to do. But to come up here at the front and say, thanks everyone for already agreeing to passing the whole idea, giving it the green light, and then even contributing more in the offering to take into consideration my wage that I'd be taking. And then to say, but I'm actually not going to do it. That was not easy, but going in on the shoulders of my father, that helped somewhat. Anyway. Okay, so let's keep going along. They go into Canaan. We know that God says, all right, if you guys don't want to go in, I'll give you what you want. And do you remember what they wanted? What did they say?
It would be better if we had died in this wilderness.
Okay, all right. Typical thing of someone who's complaining, and God says, all right, I'll give you what you want. Yeah, Max?
Sorry, question. If they sent with the cloud,
Yep.
does that mean that they weren't really actually, they weren't lost? Because they didn't move into the cloud.
Oh no, yeah, no.
So actually, they were always kept there. They weren't lost.
Yes, sorry, yeah. If I've given you the impression,
No, I've always grown up with that term, lost in the wilderness. And I'm like, hang on, the cloud was there. They weren't lost. They were kept.
they were definitely wandering. They weren't lost. No.
So it's like,
No, yeah, they knew where they were. Yeah, absolutely. And even, like there's a really good job of like the geographical locations being documented. We went here and we went there and we stayed here and we stayed there. Mind you, there's less than 2 chapters that document that 40-year period where they're, walking around in the wilderness. And God doesn't seem to spend a lot of time talking about what they did there. He does reveal some fascinating things about what they did there. One thing was that their shoes didn't wear out. Anyway, they go into Canaan. This is really good. They say, no, we want to die in the wilderness. And God goes, all right, sweet. Well, if that's what you want, I'm not going to force you in there. And then a group of them go, damn it. No, we'll go. We'll do it. And so the next day they go in and what happens to them?
They get smashed.
They get smashed. Why do they get smashed? They did the exact same thing as this. Now, this is so key. Oh man, this is such good stuff. I need to do a preaching series on this. The very thing that prevented them from going in, which was just disobeying God, was the very same thing that caused them to go in. It's just disobeying God. Like they were so enamored with their own cognitive ability to work out what it is that we should do next. They just kept on ignoring God. Now, this is so good. How many times has God told us to do something, but it was for them? And then we make a rule out of it, and we make it for always. And I'm just wondering how many times God's looked at me and gone, why do you yeah, when you were 12, that was a good thing to do. Not now. But we've got to be careful, because this is part of our nature, is we like to make rules. We like to get structures. And it's like, no, every day you get on your knees. Every day you ask for guidance. That was what the cloud was revealing to them. You don't do anything unless God says so. And when he says so, you go. Okay. All right, sweet. All right. Okay. Oh, we don't have time to do all of that. Let's do the Levites rebel. Okay, here's another picture of jealousy, like a magnitude that is just almost perplexing. But as Morgan reminded me this week, we give the Levites, well, in this case the Levites, but the Israelites by and large a hard time when we read the Pentateuch. Because I'm like, man, they're dumb. That's so stupid. Except that's probably, if we were in their shoes, we'd be doing very similar things. And we've got to be careful to make sure that we learn from these mistakes. We don't just judge an ancient people for these mistakes. Now, the Levites, they were frustrated that they didn't have the same notoriety that Aaron had, or that Moses had. And so there's, again, this story of like this miraculous sign from God. Do you remember reading what happened here? The image might help. Yep. Okay. Thanks, Harry. Right, so every tribe had to contribute a stick to Moses, who would take them into the tabernacle before the Ark of the Covenant, I think. I don't know if he was allowed in there. I'd have to check that. Anyway, it was in the tabernacle somewhere. I think it was before the Ark of the Covenant. Anyway, and he said that whoever stick sprouts by the morning will know is the one that's been chosen by God. And sure enough, Aaron's stick doesn't just sprout, but it blossoms with flowers and almonds. So he's very proud of himself and he strokes his beard. All right, so we've had another period back here in Qumran where God's told them what to do, and then they go off and to the wilderness for a couple of chapters, and they don't do mostly any of it. But we get a peculiar story here where the people again are complaining they don't have enough water. And so, what does God say to Moses? Speak to a rock. The water will flow. Then what happens? Yeah, he hits the rock, but I'm not convinced that that's what the problem was. Who did he speak to? The people. And so he hits the rock, but he says, do we have to bring water out for you? All of a sudden, Moses has fallen into the trap. thinking it's got something to do with him. It's like me and God again, you know? Buddy. Creator, created. You ain't like God. Okay, but sure, he does hit the rock. That's probably got something to do with it too. It reveals his frustration, maybe. And God says, yep, that was silly Moses. And so that's where we learn that Moses, he doesn't actually get to enter the promised land. And this again is like another good reminder for us, hey, we can't be flippant with God. He's the real deal. When he says something, we do it. If he doesn't say something, we don't do it.
So
Okay.
was it real? Was the rock a rock, or was the rock God and the water the word, or was the water water?
Is it a historical account, or is it a narrative to reveal spiritual truths? That's a great question. It's a question that people have debated for a couple of thousand years or more, maybe. I believe it was a historical account, and it was revealing spiritual truths. So I believe there was a rock. I believe there was a stick. I believe there was a Moses. I believe there was water. Would have had to have been a lot of water. 2.5 million people in the desert. Yeah, I could. I don't know if I've got time. I could talk about how maybe it wasn't 2.5 million people. Yeah. Is anyone particularly worried about the number of people? No. It could have been a lot less, depending on how we translate particular Hebrew words, but we don't have time to talk about that tonight. And that doesn't bring the Bible into disrepute, the number particularly. Okay. Who can tell me about this peculiar story?
It's just the same thing, isn't it? The complaining and then the plague or something.
Yep. Who texted me? Someone did. Ben, did you have ideas around this?
No, I just thought, wow, God's, Satan in the garden with a slithered snake, and then God puts a snake up and a stick for them to look towards, and he's got a sense of, I don't know, not a sense of humor, but it's just like, I'm God, I'll do this because I can, because I created you, created.
Yep.
Yeah.
I like that snakes don't have to be the personification of evil either. That's another aspect of like this law that is revealed to Moses. Just because something is unclean doesn't make it sinful. It can be used for judgment. It can be used for grace. The picture here, though, that I find fascinating is like the foreshadow of exactly how it is we obtain our salvation. Or might be better said, how God delivers salvation to us. In the snakes were the justice being peddled out on people. And the way to be delivered from the snake bite was to what? Yeah, just look at the snake up on the stick.
I like how that's the symbol for the paramedics as well.
Have you ever noticed that? Like it's lasted a long time, this symbol of health or healing being that of a snake wrapped around a cross or a pole. Google universal symbol for hospice or something.
It's a different symbol.
Sorry?
It's actually a different symbol.
There's 2 snakes on the ambulance one.
That's a cadipus. It's a Greek.
Alright.
It's got wings.
Sorry?
That one has wings.
Can you do for next week? I am 100% certain that there is.
It's pharma something, it's a word for like medicine, it's a symbol for medical,
Yeah.
and it goes to pharma something.
Okay, we'll let Tom do that for a little bit while we move along. Oh, but we can't move along without mentioning that this is literally a foreshadow of the cross, and we know that why? Even before Hebrews. Sorry?
Son of Man was lifted up. As a serpent was lifted up in the wilderness,
Yep.
so will the Son of Man be lifted up.
And where do you find that?
In one of those.
Yes, one of the Gospels, and it is like immediately before the most famous verse of all time.
Oh, it's a John.
3:15. So right before "For God so loved the world," and this is how he did it. Remember what happened back here in Numbers? Yeah. So this is, Jesus everywhere this week. Okay. All right. Who knows who that character is? He's got his name written there. Balaam. Who is he?
A witch doctor or something.
Something. A sorcerer or a witch doctor or a priest, depending on what translation you've got. Yep. Okay, so Balak, this king over here, king of Moab, he's not happy about the fact that the Israelites who have been kicking butt everywhere they go in the wilderness have camped outside his land. He's saying to his mates, quick, I need you to race up north. There's a witch doctor up there. He knows how to curse people. We're going to get him to pray to their God. He's going to get their God to curse them. And then that way we'll be safe. And then I've forgotten how many times it was, 3 or 7. Can't remember. Was it 3? 3 times Balaam goes to curse Israel, and 3 times blessing comes out. And so I've got this picture actually drawn on one of my surfboards, and I've had multiple people ask me, what's that? It's like, it's a witch doctor from Tehran. I'm like, what? Yeah, it's up near Syria. Why would you have that in your surfboard? It's like, it's just a reminder not to be superstitious. And I feel like there's a lot of superstition still floating around in the way we operate in prayer and churches. I grew up, the deck grip on my surfboard is also a ghost. It's a Gorilla Grip deck grip, and it's got a ghost with bat's eyes. And I know I've got Christian friends who'll be like, oh man, don't put that on your surfboard, hey, And it's like, what? The ghost is going to run up through my left foot or something. It's not big, and look, I don't want to make light of the fact that demonic spirits are real. But I'm also not superstitious to think that they have any power over me that might allow one to jump out of the deck grip and run up my leg. In fact, the Holy Spirit is so much more powerful than the Spirit that even if I had a witch doctor in my house, he wouldn't be able to curse it, he could only bless it. Which is exactly what's happened here. The witch doctor has come to look over God's people. They don't even know. It might as well be a witch has turned up outside your house and you're watching Home and Away and Neighbours. And tell me right now, if you want to invite the devil into your house, watch those 2 things. And I've got a whole spiel about that I won't do right now. But the devil he's cunning. And they don't even know he's there, and he's just blessing them. It's crazy, and we get the story of Balaam's ass. His donkey here, you can see it here. He's whipping it because the donkey wouldn't do what he wanted him to do, but the donkey had more spiritual discernment than he did, because the donkey could see that the angel of the Lord was saying, you're not going there, buddy. And eventually the angel reveals himself to Balaam, and he has a chat to the donkey. The donkey talks. It's human words. And it's not metaphor. It's a donkey speaks human. So you're going to have to come to our apologetics class to work out how you can argue that one away over a coffee with your Bible literate atheist friends. I think it's just an amazing story of God's grace, personally. Okay, so they've made their way out of Israel. They've made their way down to Sinai. They've got their law. They've got the presence of God. They do heaps of stupid things up here for 40 years. They finally find their way up into the plains of Moab, and we have the scene set now for finally this promise where the inheritance is given to the descendants, where they can be a nation and have their land and be a blessing to everyone around them. It's like finally the promise is going to be fulfilled. This big story, this 5-part story, we've watched the first 4. We know exactly now how this is all going to end. Deuteronomy is going to clear this up for us. We're going to get God in fulfilling His promises in its fullness. But you'll have to read all of Deuteronomy to find out whether or not I'm lying or not. Okay, I've got one more thing I just want to touch on, but I won't if there's any pressing questions. In your learning guides, we'll do this as a group. You've got page, yes, Holger.
So, remember when they were fighting the Midianites at the end of the book?
Yep.
And then they took all the wives and the children back?
Yep.
So first of all, pretty brutal that they had to kill the wives and
Yeah.
okay, but and then they're dividing up. What do they call it? The plunder.
Plunder. Yeah.
And 1/50 goes to the Levites.
Yeah.
So then they also get some of these girls.
Yeah.
What are they doing with the 64 girls?
The Levites.
Yes.
Marrying them.
Huh?
Marrying them.
Oh. So they're not becoming their slaves. They're more like kind of
Yeah.
slaves.
Well, I mean, if I was a dude in that desert for 40 years and there was a girl, it's like slave or wife, you know.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
They may have enslaved them. There's certainly the reason why I didn't focus on that story is because in Deuteronomy we're going to heaps more of that story and harder versions of that story, and I will address those issues in Deuteronomy. But it's like a really valid question because it's one of the hardest ones. It's one of the motivating stories for the likes of Richard Dawkins, who's put out that massive claim about God being the megalomaniac in his book The God Delusion.
What's a megalomania?
Megalomaniac. It's like the most malevolent maniac you could imagine. The worst kind of person, irrational, evil.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which God most certainly is not. But to read that story out of context might suggest he is. Okay, let's see how quickly we can do this. So, in Numbers, we've got a number of different themes revealed, and the question that I have for you guys is whether or not we can't see Jesus fulfilling any of these for us. And so the promises of God, let's read it. As Israel leaves Sinai, there is an expectation of entry into the promised land of Canaan. How has Jesus fulfilled this promise once and for all? Big voice, Carolyn?
We have entry into heaven because he died for our sins.
Okay, there's a really good one. So this was meant to be a physical representation of the kingdom of God on earth. And what do we know that Jesus came preaching? Kingdom of God, right? And we are now civilians in that particular kingdom, which will reach its fullness in heaven. Thanks, Carolyn. That's good. All right. What about the punishment of God? The answer will be literally the same every time. If you just said Jesus, you would be right.
The death of Jesus in that case.
Satisfied the wrath of God, didn't it, once and for all? Not to suggest that God isn't interested in disciplining those he loves. He is, and he will. But that the punishment of God for sin has happened. It's taken place. It's done. Nothing we can do to hang Jesus back up on the cross. You're forgiven for everything he ever did, everything that you'll ever do. That's over. That's one of the reasons why the gospel is called the gospel. Defined good news, right? The sin that has so invaded our lives and caused so much crap, we are all responsible for, has someone else shouldered the burden. That's about as good as it gets, in my opinion. Okay, presence of God.
Jesus, Holy Spirit.
Yeah, good. I reckon definitely Holy Spirit. Jesus, why it's in the name. Not Jesus, but a different name. His name. Emmanuel, there you go. Yeah. He's to be known as Emmanuel. Emmanuel means with us. It's like the fullness of God is finally with us. But he goes to sit at the right hand of God, and so he sends an advocate. Okay, good. All right. Because we're right on 8:30, I'm going to stop there. You can have a little read through those and work through those, but hopefully you'll be encouraged at how you can see in the book of Numbers, Jesus has fulfilled so many of the themes that are revealed to us. Okay, guys, let me encourage you all. You've done so well to get this far. We've got Deuteronomy to go, and then I reckon the hardest books of the Old Testament are done, and the next, what are they, 12 books? No. Yeah, the next 12 books. 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. I think it's the next 12 books, all history books. And these history books, that's just the best.